Hey everybody, welcome to the Back to Brilliance podcast. We're your hosts Henry and Joseph. Thanks for tuning in. We ask that you subscribe, leave a comment or review. It helps great people like you find our podcast. And with that, today we're going to get into our episode. We're talking about how to stop the ego and master collaborative leadership. In this episode, we're going to explore the power of replacing egos and defense language with us versus them problem framework. So we're going to discover how to actively and put this in place in simple terms, guys. So with that, I want to go ahead and bring our co-host Joseph on. Joseph, say what's up and take it away.
Hey everybody, how's it going? So today I wanted to talk about, a lot of the times, at least recently, uh, my friends they've been talking a lot about how, managers or managementship or whatever you want to say, leadership is like falling because it's always a poor manager that makes the job not fun or the manager just like treats them poorly. And so I wanted to have an episode about, you know, how to have proper communication because really that's like the fundamental pillar of leadership that is really overlooked is it's very easy to say, oh, I'm a leader. Oh, I have a fancy title or a fancy position, but do you know how to be a leader, right? And so, a lot of it does come down to how you communicate. And, there is a non-listening epidemic, which is like, just poor communication overall. Just listening or not listening, but you're waiting to just respond, right? And so in this episode, we want to go deeper into that.
Absolutely. And that's the key thing, guys, is when it comes down to it, right? We're talking about communication, and sometimes we're quick to speak and slow to listen, and those type of things create what we call the problem with bad communication. A lot of times it's just misunderstanding because of the poor communication. So that leads us into our first point. We're talking about like the non-listening epidemic, and I've been guilty of this. I'm gonna be honest because sometimes my brain thinks for solutions, and I'm always creative in that way to try to figure things out. So when I hear the problem, I kind of like I used to. I was real notorious for this, where I would hear the symptom and then immediately shoot to try to resolve that issue, And a lot of times I spent a lot of time wasted because I didn't really communicate and listen to what they were speaking, So it does take some time, to get past that non-listening epidemic, and what that stems from is like, poor communicators, we often engage in like counterfeit listening. What does that mean? It means like we act like we're listening, we're hearing, but we're not really intently listening. You know what I mean? So there's a difference between hearing and listening. And, if you've been in a relationship, you know what I'm talking about, right? In marriage, they call that selective hearing, right? So we hear what we want, and sometimes you know, we don't really fully grasp, and that type of, listening is it's kind of problematic, especially even in business, when it comes down to it, so like to fix this, from more of a passive listening to active listening. And this is kind of like bringing you in the present, right? Rather than you just like listening just to like hear them out. It's important that you try to understand where they're coming from, and communication is the key, in business, because a lot of times I think we just take it for granted, like, oh yeah, I know what they were talking about. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, and that yeah gets you in trouble. And a lot of times when you don't listen to the customer and you don't fully understand them, this may be the reason why they leave or no longer want to do business.
Exactly. And that's what I was thinking of as well as like, even if you're talking to a client and, maybe you do know more than the client or whatever the case may be, you still have to hear them out, right? Because, for me, for example, I make websites, I've made logos and stuff like that for people. So I've done a lot of like more technical things for people. and not everyone that I work with is very technical. So, they may be describing something that is very redundant to me, but it's still on me to properly listen to them, because if they see that I'm just like trying to rush them because I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, 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 sure, like Henry just said, well, that makes them feel a not seen or heard, but also they feel like, that you feel like you're too good for them, right? And so then they're a little closed off. I know one time that happened to me. I was working with a client that was referred to me, and I was honestly not really I didn't really want to work for them, but I needed the money. And so I was just kind of like trying to hurry them up constantly. And that turned out to be a really bad client for me, or I made them into a very bad client for me because I didn't want to hear them out. So instead of just trying to like get them to like finish or get to the point, really use reflective listening and like, paraphrase what they're saying. That way they see that you understand what they're saying, even if it's very simple, right? Even if it's, hey, make sure they turn off a light before you leave. Even if it's that simple, still give them the courtesy of, hey, I hear what you said. Here's what I think you said. Am I correct? And that way, if you're delegating someone or if you're working with someone, it's a lot better. It's a better form of communication because now you know that you're both on the same page, and both of you know, hey, I listened to you, right? And it goes into our next topic, which is, accusatory versus collaborative language, which, I've really been trying to focus on, especially because I'm kind of like I always say like a emotional support animal for my friends. And so sometimes like, that requires a lot of proper communication or good communication because, you know, if you don't know how to communicate with people, they don't really want to tell you their problems, right? And so, you know, and that trickles down into leadership, right? So, if your employee or if someone that you're working with is coming to you with the issue, you don't use accusatory terms like, oh, this is your fault or you, right? And so all of that breaks down into just collaborative language.
Absolutely, and picking up on that, the blaming, you always do this, you always, that immediately puts up walls on their end, and then it builds frustration, right? So and that goes in anything, and even when you're blamed for things, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, clients tend to do that, right? You said it was going to be like this, and so our walls go up. But this is why we put in this podcast together to help you guys with the tools and the techniques, to overcome this, because somewhere along the line in our lives we developed this, and I think a lot of people, right, just common nature, right? So it's like it's the ego, right? Like, who are you to tell me? I'm the expert in this field. I'm this, I'm that. So with that, we have to learn to be better communicators, and the best communication or form of the communication is listening. That's why God gave you two ears and one mouth, so you can listen twice as much and speak as little as possible. And honestly, the reality is like, when you talk to somebody that's very wise or seems wise, they don't generally say a whole lot, right? They might just say one little thing, and it's like, oh wow, it's so profound what they said, and it's not that it's so profound, or they said something because they're so wise. It's just because they become better listeners. So they actually are, as you're speaking, they're listening, taking that in, and when they give you an answer, it's so simple and so profound because like they understand, like this is the real problem. So killing the giant ego, this is our next point we're talking about, and it's because bad leaders operate with massive egos, right? We get hostile at negative feedback, or act like jerks, like when people, belittle, so I understand like the ego part, it does happen. And I've been there, many times where people have told me things and I'm like, ah man, let me tell you. So it's like, but you learn from it. You have to learn from it, and it's sometimes when you hear it more than twice or more than three times, guys, there's definitely a problem. You know what I mean? And it's up to you to make the changes. And this is kind of one of the things, So if you're like, when you're explaining something and you have to explain it a thousand different ways to try to make them understand it, maybe it's not that they're not understanding, it's just you're not communicating properly. You know what I mean? So like communication is so basic, but it's so broad, right? So like you have to learn this. It's a tool, but one of the first things is the importance of communication is listening.
Exactly. And, the ego is a great way to silence, or like, the ego will get in the way of you listening, right? Because again, like that example that I gave where, I just wanted to get I would say customer or client, um, my client to, just get to the point or whatever, because I knew that they didn't really know what they were talking about in a more technical term or a technical way. So that ego prevented me from being able to listen to them because I was like, okay, well, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, and right there, that's my ego talking, right? Or, my buddy, he had a case where, I don't want to say too much, but let's just say that public shaming was like the culture of that company that he was in, and he quit because of it, because it was a very public thing, and like it's a very, it's not an environment that you want to facilitate or continue doing. And so, just being a good leader means that you don't have an ego, or that you try to limit your ego when you're dealing with others, because whenever you have employees or customers or clients, you want them to work with you, right? And so, they can't work with you if your ego is so big that you don't allow others in, or if you don't even see that people can help you, right? And so, a lot of the times, great leaders will practice self awareness and actively, ask for advice, like, hey, how am I holding back the project, or hey, am I doing something wrong, right? And so, that's something that I practice a lot, where not in a self-deprecating way, but hey, like, I'll come to my friends and I'll be like, hey, like I feel like I'm being a little rude today, or I feel like I'm being a little bit rough around the edges, like, do you agree? I've done that pretty recently, to be honest. And just being honest, and having people be honest with you, not only does that show that you're willing to listen, but it shows that you're a good leader, because a good leader is someone that listens to what the people around them are saying.
Yeah, that's good info there. I mean, you're better than me, Joe. I don't ask. I just know that I'm better. No, I'm kidding, guys. I'm kidding. We're just joking around. We keep it light around here, but no, it's good to have that accountability of people. You know what I mean, around you, to let you know. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times we don't see our own faults, right? Until it's like there's something that happens that, like, well, what caused this? And then if somebody's honest with you, they'll tell you, and I've had that, that it's not fun when somebody tells you, especially when it's like a, money involved in paying client and, all these things, because we have our egos that are like, it's challenged, right? But I go back and I think about it, because I'm like, all right, cool. Like there's got to be something to what they're saying, right? So I make it better in my life for the other people, and it's just all a learning process, guys. Nobody has it all figured out. Trust me. Have you ever gotten a bill from a company and call them up and they're just telling you it is what it is, deal with it? You know what I mean? You have your version of them and what you think, So like the whole issue is that when you have a company that listens to you, and a business that listens, this is speaking from the client side, they're going to be more prone to do business with you, because they know you really care and value the relationship and the communication is there, So, which moves us to our next point: how to stop avoiding conflict and start managing with clear metrics and future oriented feedback. This is what we're talking about, that feedback, right? It's not always easy to accept feedback. You know what I mean? That used to be a big thing with companies, right? They used to put that on their websites and all that stuff. Oh, please give us feedback. Please give us feedback. Well, they got so much bad feedback that they took it off. You know what I mean? So, what that does is, for those that are still willing, they do surveys now, right? Because they want to see on how things are going, right? So they got the data, and they use that for their benefit to bring training, to do these things, so that way things are better. So if big companies and corporations are spending millions of dollars on this, I think it's pretty important, especially when we're in a niche, or the small guy trying to deliver a quality product or service. You have to look at these things, you know what I mean? So feedback is definitely important.
Exactly. And even whenever you're gonna, have a difficult conversation with, maybe a client or a team member or whatever the case may be, you know, be data driven and not drama driven, right? And what I mean by that is like, instead of saying, "Oh, well, you've been lazy this month. Oh, you're not getting your work done," or "Hey, client, you're like slowing down the process because you're lazy, or you're not getting back to me on time." You know, just show them metrics, right? Show them, "Hey, we could have had this project up, 7 days ago, but because of this like issue that took 3 days to solve, now the project is behind." Or, "Hey, I see that you're not that your efficiency is low," or whatever qualitative measurements that you can provide. That way people can be like, "Okay, yeah, maybe I am slacking a little bit," right? That way they come to that conclusion, and not so much like, "Hey," accusatory terms, right? You're not like, "Hey, I see that you're not working this week," or "Why aren't you getting your work done?" Right? That's very accusatory. And so, again, that will just only shut people down, not only the people that you're working with, but the people working with you, right? And so that also kind of, turns us into our next point, which is like the power trap, right? So, poor management happens when the boss gives out work with no clear standards, or constantly changes their mind, or like interferes with with delegating the process, right? So maybe they tell you, "Hey, I want this due on Friday," and then Wednesday comes around and they're like, "Okay, I want it due end of day," right? Or maybe they change, like, "Oh, here's like the objectives of the week. Scratch that. Here's the new objectives," right? So you want to give a clear, concise message and the clear expectations of your project, not only to your team members, but to your clients. That way, they know what you're giving them, and and your team members know exactly what to do to fulfill what you want.
Absolutely, and that's the reality, right, of a lot of businesses. I mean, that's why so many programs exist today, like Slack. You know what I mean? That's one of the good programs that are out there in place for big businesses, because it helps everybody to know, what the role is, and it avoids that poor management from the power trap, right? Like today's day and age, when it comes down to corporate America, everything is metrics. They don't care about anything else other than the metrics. So, with that, people are going to make mistakes if they don't understand, right? So it just comes down to communication. It has nothing to do with capabilities or willingness, or performance. It all comes down to, I didn't know. That's always what ends up coming out, like, "Oh, I didn't know that's what you wanted. I didn't know that's how it was." Well, it's poor communication. So if as an employee, this happens, as an entrepreneur, this happens when you're dealing with clientele, so so that brings us to our next point. We're talking about like future oriented feedback, where which is very important, right? So when you're correcting somebody, you want to protect their self-esteem, right? You want to focus on the behavior rather than attacking the person. You want to provide that constructive criticism. You want to boost them up rather than tear it down, right? So how do we apply that? That's for employees, right? Or even contractors, anybody you're working with. You don't want to come in and, hey, well, you did a piss poor job, blah blah blah, and that doesn't motivate them. That doesn't inspire them. It frustrates them. It builds rage in them. You know what I mean? And sometimes if they can't communicate how they're feeling or what they're thinking, because you're the paying boss, like, it's the same way that it works when you're dealing with your client, right? They're your paying boss. So like, you have to eat humble pie, you know what I mean, and like suck it up. But it's good when you have that bridge and that communication. So working on these tools is going to help you in the long run, and you always get that clear agreement, together, like, okay, this is what's expected, this is what we're going to deliver, so always lead by example. You know what I mean? Most things in life, you must be the change you want to see, right? Because your team will be the direct reflection of you. So a lot of times, this is what we say: everything rises and falls on leadership. So if things went bad, it's not really their fault. It was the leadership's fault, because the leadership couldn't explain it. And how come they couldn't explain it? Because of communication. So that's what we're basically talking about. So you need to, um, you need to give that example and set that. But if you don't know how, then it's tools like this podcast and others out there, that can help you. But definitely, this is kind of where you want to be.
Exactly. And, I want to second what Henry just said, right? Lead by example, because, if you have a culture of, hey, let's not be accountable, or hey, let's have improper communication, well, that will trickle down, right? So, if you never display, you know, uh, active listening, who's to say that? Let's say you have a couple employees. Who's to say that maybe your manager is not actively listening to the team members, right? And so it all starts from the top. And so because you never displayed the culture that you want, well, the culture around you is going to reflect what you haven't shown them. And so, that's kind of what I've done with my friends. Not to say that I manage my friends per se, but, I lead by example by saying, hey, I don't want to partake in this, or, you know, uh, I've had some friends where they talk behind each other's backs, and I set the example of, hey, I don't want to talk behind this person's back. They're not here to defend themselves, so there's no real point in like continuing this conversation, because all it is it's only gonna lead to drama, right? And so, I've noticed that my friends have stopped backbiting, if you want to say, in that regard, because they saw how I am. Maybe they still do it whenever I'm not there, but again, at least whenever I'm there, they uphold that standard. And the same thing is with your company, right? And so lead by example, because not only are you going to be able to be transparent with what you do, but people are going to feel more open, because they're going to see, okay, well, he's not like Henry's not going to shoot down my ideas automatically, and he's going to actually listen to what I have to say, right? And so that breeds a healthy work culture, or work environment.
Absolutely. And, so it all comes down, guys, like we're talking, to stop that ego, and to master the collaborative leadership. Like I said, everything rises and falls on leadership. So the problem is generally bad communication, you know what I mean? And that leads us to like non-listening epidemic, right? We just hear what we want to hear, and then we make judgments based on that. And I've been guilty of that. So this is why we're sharing, some of the mistakes that we've made. And in that, we hope that the mistakes that we share with you saves you time and helps you to understand that, uh, ahead of time, so you don't have to go down that road, and then killing the giant ego, this type of thing. I'm the boss, I'm the expert, like, I think, let it go, guys, let it go, and it comes down, to taking that, you know, ego and just putting it aside, because we're here to serve and to deliver a good quality of product or service, whatever it is you're doing, and taking that feedback, guys. You know what I mean? Feedback is important. It's not always fun. It's not always, great to accept, but it's important, and it helps you. And you could lead by exampleship. You know what I mean? Again, we're talking about like lifting up, when you're going to give that feedback and stuff, make sure it's positive. You know what I mean? And if you're not feeling positive today, don't go confront somebody about it. That's not the time. You know what I mean? There's a time and a place for everything. So cool yourself down, gather your thoughts, and then go back and give that constructive criticism and give that communication out, and yeah, the whole thing comes down to, guys, is just communication. That's the key. So with that, I want to bring Joseph back on if he has any closing thoughts before we end the podcast.
Yeah, again, just really just take the time and listen to what people say, because once you have a full picture of what they're saying, that will really allow you to be a better communicator, because once you hear them, then you can accurately give a response to them. And I also want to give a shout out to our community. If you're an entrepreneur tired of doing everything alone, we have a community that combines practical self-growth tools as well as community support and weekly structure to help you stay focused and follow through with whatever you're trying to do. So that's at backtobrilliance.com. If you scroll down to our community section, you'll be linked up with like-minded people like you.
Well said. And with that, guys, we want to thank you for tuning in to our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment or review. It helps great people like you find our podcast. And with that, we're out. Till the next time. Stay blessed.
Bye-bye.